Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 128th Istanbul bi-weekly meetup. Today, I have Pradyun with us. He's a software engineer at Bloomberg and also the maintainer of PIP, one of the maintainers of PIP. He is a moderator on PyPI and also very active on the documentation groups like things. He also made a new team called Furo, which is really awesome. Today he's going to talk about how to write horrible documentation. Before we start, please let me know if you have any questions through comments. He will answer them after his slides are over. Yeah, stage is yours, Pradyun.
Ooh, yay! Hello, everyone. I guess let's get started. The obligatory slide about me, where to find me on the internet, some of the things I do that have already been talked about, actually, and just a context of, well, stuff I work on. It's YouTube, so you can pause. And talking of pausing, this is where you can get the slides that I'm presenting, these exact slides. If you're wondering, it's like 50 megabytes. And with that out of the way, let's get to the main act. How to write horrible documentation. Well, horrible technical documentation. A lot of the things I'm going to talk about today will apply to other things, user manuals and stuff. But the focus today is technical documentation, the kind that's hosted on like a website on the internet or something like that. There's lots of talks about sort of talks, blog posts, guides, just about how to write documentation with a focus on writing good documentation. Our goal is the exact opposite for today. We want to write horrible documentation, the kind that's like difficult to, well, work with. And here's the obligatory list of everything I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to read through it now, but each of these is something we're going to talk about in a decent amount of detail. And as you're reading this, if it's fairly clear what each of these sections mean and what they'll contain, well, then this slide worked perfectly, and I'm very happy about how I structured this talk. So let's get started with probably the most impactful and subtle tool that we have, the documentation's structure. Where do you put what information? Right? This is about how your readers will move around and find things in your documentation. And here's 3 ways that we can sabotage that. We can spread the information they're looking for in ways that is not obvious, put related content in different places, and make it difficult for them to find each of those places from each other, right? Or mix low-level and high-level details. Have them on the exact same page so that someone reading it has difficulty navigating it and has to pick and choose the bits that they understand / need. Or just have like lots of information on the same page, right? It's great if it's not related, but sort of useful if you know what you're looking for. And it's just make it a big dump of information, right? And then you have, like, the user has to go and find where to look what. And like, it's difficult to find it because it's just multiple long pages have multiple different bits of information, each of these combining with each other pretty well. The goal here is, well, making the discovery of information more difficult. Now, the problem is that there's a tool for solving this. Search. Like, this is literally what it does, right? It makes it easier to find information. So what can we do? Well, the first bullet's fairly obvious. Just don't have search. Don't let your search engines find the relevant information properly by like subtly sabotaging what ways they index your page in and stuff like that. Or have search that's like difficult to use, like to the point that it's not useful anymore, right? Like requiring exact matches, which is if you know what you're looking for exactly, only then can you find it. You need to know the name of the class exactly to be able to find that class's documentation. If you make a typo there, or if you make a case-sensitive mistake, well, you can't find it anymore. Or, well, if you don't have access to documentation search like that, a good thing you can do is just hide that search bar somewhere such that people can't find it. Put it in like the bottom right of your site. That's only visible after scrolling. It's not visible when you're looking at content, things like that. Or if you're in the middle of the page. These are just great ways to like, well, you give them search, but they can't find it or use it when they need it. Or if they are on a page and they're looking for things, they'll probably go back to somewhere else and then come back over or whatever, right? So that's another. Now, we're talking about have what you can do with information you have, right? Well, you can also just leave gaps, right? There's always a trade-off of like what detail you go into, how much information you put in the documentation. Like it's a balancing act. Skew that. Just mention things that you don't need to. Omit things that you should have included. And mention things that the user don't have an easy way to know more about, right? Because they're not documented. And when you sort of combine this with the whole bad side structure that we talked about just now, it works even better. And so far, we've been sort of talking about what you can do with information, right? And like correct information you've provided. Don't provide correct information. This is easy because you sort of do this even when you're trying to write good documentation, because there's just so much attention you can pay, right? But you can also do these in subtle ways, so that people like the untrained eye doesn't notice, or you can call it a matter of preference and then have your way. Yeah, like writing wrong descriptions, you might be able to slip that through. Now, doc test is a super cool tool. It checks that your code snippets and like code examples in your documentation match exactly how the code works by like running the code. And it's like super cool and it helps prevent these mistakes. So don't use it. If someone says you should use it, say that your tooling doesn't support it, or use tooling that doesn't support it, or come up with an argument that it's difficult to configure because of your project being structured a certain way. You can also change your project so that it's difficult to use with doc test, but we will get to that later. Or you can even write examples in a way that you can't doc test them. I guess that works too. There's also like blog posts about how doc test is bad actually, that sort of talk about how it's not a substitute for unit tests and that their overuse is bad as a justification for not using them at all. It works. Like they might convince the people reading is. So there's that. Another good way is there's information the user would find useful when they're using a tool so that they don't make mistakes while using that thing, right? So don't discuss those things. Obscure the information that you're providing around that. Body it, as the slide says, and make it unclear which approach is nicer and which approach is easier or just less error prone. And make it unclear which one is actually not supposed to be used anymore. This helps create confusion, and well, that's the goal, right? Another good thing to do is make assumptions about who the reader is, right? Because we're talking about being wrong, and use he everywhere when you're referring to the user or giving examples. Make the site difficult to read, or make it difficult for screen readers. include images without any alt text, make it difficult to read your pages on high zoom levels. Like, there's lots of ways to like just hamper accessibility. You can read about that. I mean, there's lots of content, is what I meant for that. And I can't go into all of it here. Talking or making assumptions about the reader, assume what they know. Yeah, just honestly, this is kind of difficult to elaborate on. It's very easy to make assumptions about who the reader is and get away with it. And that makes it perfect for what we're trying to do. Because what we want to do is make it difficult for the reader to understand what we have written. And jargon, as the site says, is a great way to do that. Acronyms also help because, well, you can sort of, it's an abstraction layer that distances the actual information from what the user is reading. And they need to know that link, that information to understand what's written. And make the thing difficult to understand. We sort of talked about this in the earlier slide, but mixing these levels of like high-level concepts and low-level concepts makes it genuinely difficult to understand what's written. And makes it also difficult to sort of pick apart what's written and genuinely gain an understanding of the material. Jargon helps sort of add that additional layer and obscure the entire process of understanding and really getting a feel for what's being told. Another way to make it really difficult to understand is, well, when you make things difficult to understand, you will be told to add a glossary page, a page that's defining everything that you're using, all these jargony terms that you're using and whatnot. So you can just define them with not so simple words, with cross-references to other definitions so that it looks complicated when it really is not. Or actually modeling the entire complexity as is in your glossary page without trying to simplify the problem. And just piling on so that it's even those pages when they're supposed to be helpful are not, but just, making it a little more difficult to navigate. Inconsistency. That's really the big tool that you have for doing this, right? This is the thing that will annoy people in a subtle way or make it unclear to them in a subtle way. But like most people won't catch why they are feeling that way about the reading material they're reading. Mix of writing styles, this is something that everyone talks about being consistent on. Don't. You don't even need to use the same spellings for color and all the other fun words that British and American English are different on. You can just mix and match things. Sources of truth. This is something we talked about a little earlier as well. These are all interconnected. Mixing sources of truth, having the same information in two different places in slightly different ways, right? So one of them is talking about this at a high level, one of them is talking about this at a low level, or one of these is talking about these from one perspective, the other is from another perspective, and just have them be there independently and separately so that you keep the two of them in sync. And so that you can sort of slip in a contradiction here and there. This is very nicely matching with what you are expected to do, right? Because if you're writing it from the perspective of a client, that's going to be different from the perspective of a server, right? And you can't actually have the same content in both places. So it's possible to just slip in contradictions here and there and make it unclear what is actually the real thing. Until you actually go ahead and try it and see that actually both of them are wrong, because we could do that. Inconsistency typos. This is probably the first thing you think of when you say something was wrong in documentation, right? This is sort of the common PR that you get from people on an open source project. or the common easy PR that you will get from people. Well, yeah, it's good to have them. People will catch it. Most of the time, they won't even do anything about it, uh, especially if it's like an internal project. And bonus points if it's like similar names and you mess up between them. PyPI, PyPy, MyPy, very similar. You could read them very similarly if you've never heard of them. And mixing how you write the exact same thing can help. Inconsistency, right? So here's 3 cases for writing pip. Which one's correct? Yet another approach is just making everything look, well, bad. Make it look like the site was built in the 90s and hasn't been updated since, right? Make odd font choices such that, like, unless you're used to that, you won't like it. Make it difficult to read by just keeping it small. And don't support mobile users, because who reads technical documentation on a mobile? Why would you do that? So do these little things that sort of modern web design is converging towards, and, well, don't do them. Bad site designs. Well, sort of what the last slide says, but more concretely, right? Have poor navigational capabilities is talking about making it difficult to move around the site, making it difficult to figure out where you are on the site and where you can go to next. So what's around this site page that you're on, what's related, what's nearby in sort of a, well, site navigational sense. And sort of have those little things that are misaligned just by a few pixels here and there, so that anyone who has like a web design background comes here and goes, why have you done that? And so just in line with the whole accessibility thing, just have low contrast color choices so that it's difficult to sort of know what's where, what's different from what, and just make it difficult to figure out differences, right? And it helps if it also looks like it's really old. The other option, actually, this should be low and high contrast choices, because some people, well, put blue on pink and, well, make it difficult to read. Making it difficult to work with. This is tricky. This is about workflows and making them more difficult so that changes are more difficult to make, so that fixing the mess that you've made is more difficult than it probably should be. This is tricky if you're in a space where there's standard procedures or standard approaches for doing things. Thankfully, in some of those situations, these processes actually help incentivize doing all the things we just talked about by like institutionalizing those problems, by making it actually difficult to have, genuinely difficult to have good site design and stuff, because, hey, it's institutionalized, it's the standard procedure. And this is what we've been doing for so long, and there's credibility attached to what we're doing. So yeah, that's how you make it difficult to make changes. And that's sort of institutional. You can also do this with workflows. You can have these custom things that you build for writing documentation that are not standardized, so that this knowledge doesn't sort of move around or no one can bring in additional context and help you, because it's all custom to you. And have these fragile things built around your documentation so that, well, building it is fragile, it breaks sometimes, and someone has to go and fix that. And the easiest way when we're talking about workflows is making it unclear what to do. Have this, you know how to build that thing. And some of these are just software engineering practices that we avoid. So it's a balancing act, because if you're in an environment with a lot of software engineers, they'll notice this and call it out. Say that it's a matter of trade-offs and get away with it. if your documentation build pipeline has these horrible failure messages, that will help too. And it's not just workflows that can be complex, so can your content, right? Remember how I was talking about client-facing documentation? Like the same documentation about clients would be different from servers, but there will be something common, right? So you could just treat your documentation like code and just make it dry. Don't repeat yourself. And like have these fancy includes that such that you get this snippet from here, this snippet from here, and just make this convoluted and messy, right? But you made it dry, so that's an improvement. And this sort of complexity will make it difficult to make changes, because the change you make in the context of the client won't make sense in the context of the server. And then you start duplicating content that's subtly different, and then you can start introducing those contradictions we talked about. So you can all of some of this is inherent, and you can exploit that to just make this worse. And it helps if you sort of inject these quirky custom things into that, just so that this thing looks slightly nicer. My favorite example of this is introducing admonitions in a tool that doesn't support them, which is like a call out, and it's like all custom, and then it doesn't work. And then you're like, oh no, what's happening? In conclusion, there's lots of ways to do these things. There's many of these will happen organically, and you can do all of these things in ways that feel natural, because a lot of this will happen naturally. A lot of this is something that you will keep doing yourself if no one sort of called it out. And now that you sort of hopefully know these, you will use this information to not write horrible documentation, to write documentation that's easier to understand by like avoiding a lot of these things, hopefully, or maybe not. To wrap this up, because I'm doing it a little quickly because I'm excited, shout outs to CGP Grey, whose 7 Ways to Maximize Misery was sort of the inspiration for structuring the talk the way that I did. Eric Horscher's excellent guide on the Write the Docs website about how to, well, get started with writing documentation. This Systematic Framework for Technical Documentation Authoring by Daniel is excellent. You might have seen this if you're in these spaces as documentation.dovio or Divio. And this is the new home for it. And thanks to Twitter staff who helped me sort of come up with this stock concept and sort of this whole reversing approach to it. And that's it. Questions? I did really well on time.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
We can take questions. I think we have already 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is, what are some real-world projects with perfect documentation?
Ooh, perfect documentation. I don't know if that exists, but there are some projects with excellent documentation. Django is probably the one that comes to mind most easily, where they have like very clear guidance for every little thing, and have clear separation of the various bits of content, as well as a really good tutorial if you're actually getting started. And just there's everything you need is there. You can navigate the site well and stuff like that. So Django comes to mind. Perfect documentation is, well, documentation is a lot like software, right? It keeps evolving as you go. So, and it sort of has to be in sync with whatever the thing is that you're building. So both of these have to sort of evolve together. So I don't think it ever becomes perfect, but it can always get better.
The second question is, do you have any advice for non-native technical documentation writers?
Ooh, non-native technical documentation writers. I think the Write the Docs community has a lot of content for this. I mentioned one of these in in the shoutouts. Actually, I can't navigate anymore. Any advice? Look, there's lots of good advice. I am probably not a good person to do this because I'm exactly in that non-native technical documentation writers group myself. So I'm not sure I can give advice to others in that context because I don't know as much as many others do. But I think the easiest bit that comes to mind is think about minimizing intertwinedness in your documentation, like similar to sort of coupling and cohesion in software, of like make it easier to find bits and have them be independent of each other, but keep the relationship clearer. And it helps if the actual thing you're describing has that, but if it doesn't, you can sort of still do that in the documentation to make that clear. And there's the systematic framework I talked about, which is really just an excellent read for even if you're a technical documentation writer, because it gives you a vocabulary and framework to think in. It's not a framework in the sense of React and stuff, but it's a way to think about things. And that should help. It helped me.
The third question is, when onboarding to a new project, if the documentation is not right or non-existent, what steps would you take to make it right?
Ooh. I think the easiest bit is getting the onboarding experience yourself and documenting it as you go, right? So this is a new project. I don't know how to get started. Okay, I'm figuring out how to get started. Let me also write down how I did that and then convert that into something that's actually formally documented. And then picking up tiny bits and pieces and doing it. Not being like, okay, I'm going to solve all of your documentation problems in the next 3 months, because that's not going to happen. And even if you're highly experienced in the domain, you're biting off more than you can chew. So just make it incremental, make it small, and get consensus from the people, like from the project that you're onboarding on, that this is a problem worth solving before actually pushing it through. Because it's best to sort of have the existing people be on board to what you're doing and sort of facilitate that rather than block it. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of open source projects actually need good documentation and good documentation writers. So that's like a really good way to chime in.
Yep, for sure.
If we don't have any more questions, I think we can end it.
Yep.
Wait a couple.
Yeah. Am I still? Ooh, did I end it? Give me 1 sec. Hey, that works. So, hey, that's about it, right?
Yeah, that's about it. Thank you, Pradyun, for being with us in Istanbul and for your talk.
This was lovely. I kept it a little short, but hey, I'm glad it worked out. See ya.
Yeah. See ya, everybody.